according to our calculations, 97% of the primate fossil record is still unknown. And that guarantees job opportunities for paleontologists for at least 30,000 years.
Hello, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Robert Martin, Emeritus Curator at the Field Museum in Chicago, an academic guest at the Institute for Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich. So welcome, Professor Martin. Could you please give a brief overview of your career in research?
I started out as a zoologist. I did both my degrees at the University of Oxford in England, and the first degree was in zoology. And I then went on to do a PhD and did 2 years research in Germany before going back to write up my thesis. My PhD work was on treeshrews in Germany, and I studied their behavior. And the reason I chose them is because at that time, treeshrews were believed to be the most primitive living primates. They were classified along with the real primates in the same order. And so I thought it'd be a good idea, because everything was anatomically based at the time. I thought it would be a good idea to look at behavior and see whether that gave any clues. And after a year, I was convinced that treeshrews couldn't possibly have any evolutionary connection to primates. And so I spent the next 2 years learning up everything I could in all possible disciplines to collect evidence to. And so that's how I started out. And I got really interested in reproductive biology. So it was my PhD that set me on course to do evolution of primates with an emphasis on reproductive biology. I then got a lectureship at University College London in the anthropology department, and I was there for 17 years. And I did a lot of lecturing on primate and human evolution and various other topics to do with primatology. And towards the end of that period, I was invited to come to Zurich, where I am now, to interview for a position in the Institute of Anthropology here as the director and as the only professor in the department. And I did that then for 15 years. And then I decided I needed a challenge. So I was approached to take up the position of Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Field Museum, with a curatorship in anthropology. And so I did that for 12 years until I retired, not fully, but on paper, I retired at the end of 2013. And then a year later, I returned to my home base in Zurich, and I've been there ever since. And I have an office I can use in the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine here on the campus. So that in a nutshell is my career. It's pretty linear.
Yeah, thank you. And what would you say is your most significant research achievement or the accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Yeah, it's a very general answer that I would give to that, because from the very outset, starting with my research on treeshrews, I worked across an incredibly broad range, unusually broad. And, you know, people always say that jack of all trades, master of none. And clearly that's a price you pay. If you work in so many different fields, then you can't work to the depth that everybody does if they're a specialist in just one of those fields. But I pride myself on the fact that I set out knowingly to acquire as much knowledge as I could across the board, because I was convinced that the only real way to understand primate evolution properly was to combine evidence from all directions, particularly because of the treeshrew question. As I said, everybody at the time included treeshrews in primates. George Gaylord Simpson, in his seminal classification of 1945 had taken the step of actually putting them in the primates, and everybody regarded them as the most primitive living representatives. And I saw, as I said, looking at them as an opportunity to understand something about the earliest primates, about the first characters that would have characterized the order that eventually led to us. So it's really the breadth of my approach that I would emphasize most of all. But in 1990, I brought out a textbook called Primate Origins, and that was a direct reflection of those broad interests. I covered everything, and I think I was the only one at the time who took into account genetic and molecular evidence. That was in its infancy. And by pure fortune, my boss at the University College London, Nigel Barnicott, was doing pioneering research into using genetic molecular information to look at evolutionary relationships. Like me, he started off in organismal biology, but he realized that it would be important to include genetics and molecular studies. And that proved to be prophetic, because molecular studies have really boomed since that time. I'm talking back in the mid-1960s. That's when it was really getting underway. And out of that grew molecular anthropology, using molecular data with new techniques. And you can get really precise, comparable data from molecular studies, and that really changed the whole ballgame. It's changed an enormous amount since I brought out my book in 1990. I mean, that's now 35 years ago, and molecular evolution has really become an enormous field by now, and it's completely reliable. It made a lot of mistakes early on, but it's really extremely powerful now as a tool. And it's independent of the classical evidence from physiology, anatomy, ecology, you name it.
In your view, what is the most important idea you hold that it differs from the widely accepted perspectives in biological anthropology?
Yeah, I mean, I've got in a lot of hot water for this, but one of the key concerns in my research has been to estimate the time of origin of the common ancestor of primates. Okay, so I want to know how old is the origin of primates. And I've encountered a lot of opposition from paleontologists, and still do, because what has happened in paleontology is, if you say, when did the primates start evolving? They would say, well, the earliest primate we know is 55 million years old, so add 5 million, 60 million years ago. And this is based on the assumption that the fossil record is good enough that we can take the first known fossil as an indicator of the time of origin. What it indicates is the minimum time of origin. We know that primates were around by 55 million years ago, but the fossil record does not give us the time of origin. You know, you can guesstimate beneath that, but the fact of the matter is there is still no way of determining an actual time of origin from the fossil record. But as I said, paleontologists hate this, but I got together with a very good mathematician, Simon Tabaret, and Simon talked with me about modeling this. And the key idea was to take the entire primate fossil record known at the time and produce randomly branching trees with certain ground rules, and then slot in fossils at various time levels and say, well, given the tree, given the branching times, given the fossil record, what is the likeliest date for their origin? And we got a date not of 60 or 65 million years, but around 90, 85 to 90. Okay. And one of the calculations we were able to conduct was that from our model, how many primate species, fossil primate species should there be, and what percentage have we discovered so far? And the answer was around 3 to 5%, which means that 95 to 97% of the fossil record is unknown to us in terms of species. That's a pretty fine mesh. So at the higher level, we have a better understanding. If you look at individual genera and families and so on, then you might think you have a more precise interest. But you know, I've given talks on this with paleontologists in the audience, and you know, I said I really don't understand the opposition to this, because according to our calculations, 97% of the primate fossil record is still unknown, and that guarantees job opportunities for paleontologists for at least 30,000 years. And so I can't understand the resistance. But the interesting thing is that I published a paper with Simon Tavray and others in Nature. Christoph Soligo, who's at University College now, and actually has the job I originally had, was a co-author. And anyway, that was published in Nature in 2001. It was the time when I moved to the field, and in 2001 was the initial paper that was published on that, so 24 years ago. In the meantime, that paper has rarely been even cited in paleontological papers. If it is, it's cited to dismiss the conclusions. Whereas in molecular papers, it has been cited very frequently and positively. So there is a divide there between people doing molecular tree building and people doing classical paleontology. The thing is that I admire primate fossil people, paleontologists. They have to work under really demanding conditions, often in outlying places that are hard to get to and so on. They work really hard, and they have to be really fortunate to discover key fossils. But discovering fossils doesn't give them the right to set dates which are not justified. My basic point is that if the fossil record is sparse, you're going to underestimate times of origin if you rely on the known fossil record. If you have a really good fossil record, like dinosaurs, for example, they're big and worldwide distribution, and so the chances of discovering a new dinosaur are pretty high. And so there's a pretty dense fossil record, and I think there we have a pretty good idea of times of origin. But there's a worse case than primates, by the way, in mammals and bats. There is a fossil record under 1%. They're the fossil record of bats is very poorly known. They're small mammals, tend to live in forests, most of them. And we have a very sparse fossil record. So, and yet, I mean, one of the things I do is look at the fossil record and see what it tells us about likely origin. Is the origin close, or was it far away? There's a wonderful fossil site in Messel in the mid-Eocene. These are primates and other mammals that are around 50 million years old. And there are over 100 bat specimens. I think it must be half the world collection of bat fossils comes from that one site. And they have it's an oil shale deposit, so you get complete animals preserved between plates of shale. And they have bats with wings, and you can look at the ear region using scanning devices, and the ear region is adapted for ultrasound location, and there are stomach contents preserved in the shale, and in those stomach contents there are scales from the wings of the moths that they caught with sonar at night, and those moths are from the same families as they are today. All of that was already present in the first bats that we have in the fossil record. Prior to that, we have nothing. And we're supposed to accept that bats originated between 65 and 55 million years ago and developed all of their key characters, wings, echolocation, so on. I can't put a figure on that. I'm just saying, well, that's an amazingly short time to get a perfect bat. And we see this with every single order of mammals. 50 million years ago, in every order of mammals, we have completely formed close relatives of what we see today. Look at whales and dolphins, for example, and so on. All of the key characters develop very early on. In hoof mammals, for example, in the artiodactyls, the even-toed mammals, they have a pulley arrangement in the ankle, which is unique to that group of mammals, and that is present in the earliest known fossils. But there's no precursors. We don't know how that evolved. It's just there in the fossil record. I think we still have a lot to learn about the fossil record. So I've taken a risk. I've tried mathematical modeling to estimate the size of the error we have been making.
Thank you. And I guess the follow-up question would be, if there's an older date than some people suggest maybe 60, 70 million years. If it's 90 or more million years ago, what are the implications for some of the well-known fossil primate groups like the Omomyids and the Adapids, and potential, or what that some people consider potential early primates, the plesiadapiforms? Like, what's the kind of implications for living primate groups and their common ancestors within these groups or prior to these groups, if that question makes sense?
Right. That's a very, very astute question, Ian. I mean, it really gets to the heart of the matter. And you've chosen a very good example in mentioning early relatives of tarsiers and lemurs, the Adapidae and the Omomyidae, for example, which, by the way, both appear 55 million years ago, with a lot of key pre-primate features in situ. So the earliest obvious primates we see in the fossil record also date back to 55 million years ago. Okay, so I have one key point here is, again, this is something I read extremely widely, is continental drift. And that was essentially ignored by mammalogists. And I don't think any other primate book on primates, even today, seriously mentions continental drift. And it was actually rejected by paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, who wrote the definitive classification of mammals. Actually wrote a paper proving that continental drift couldn't have happened using the mammal fossil record. He was, of course, wrong. And we now know that continental drift is a fact. And we have wonderful reconstructions of what took place. But the basic problem is that if primates originated less than 65 million years ago, then the position of the continents is not terribly relevant. But if primates originated 90 million years ago, then they were at still in an active phase of continental drift that was important enough to have influenced the origin of mammalian orders. I mean, the one very brief point is that, of course, if I'm right, then placental mammals were around and thriving alongside the dinosaurs. But another corollary of that is that probably a lot of them died out when the asteroid impact took place on the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary and wiped out an awful lot of organisms, including all the dinosaurs. But the thing is that you wouldn't even think of looking at continental drift if primates and other mammals, because this isn't unique to primates. What is being argued by mammal paleontologists is that placental mammals originated after the dinosaurs died out. Okay, that's all mammals, all placental mammals. And we know that quite a lot of, everybody accepts that more primitive mammals were present earlier. The mammals originated 200 million years ago. So they had 135 million years to diversify until the dinosaurs died out. And then the dinosaurs having died out, there were a lot of empty ecological niches, and so they radiated. One of the points that I'm making is that if primates originated 90 million years ago, they would have radiated to various branches, and some of those branches would have died out with the dinosaurs, and then primates would have had to re-radiate after the so there are actually two primate radiations at 90 million and after 65 million. So a key answer to your question here is continental drift. And I think a major factor here in the big gaps in fossil record we're looking at is because all the action was in the southern continents until around 55 million years ago. And then an awful lot of groups migrated to the north. And so we're picking them up in the fossil record. We have a very, very poor fossil record of the southern continent, South America, Africa, Asia, Australasia. That fossil record is not very good. One of the reasons is that fossil finding is much more likely at moderate latitudes. At low latitudes around the equator, fossil finding is very, very scarce. The peak finds for dinosaurs and everything else are around 45 degrees latitude. So things are working against us. I think mammals, modern placental mammals, were around alongside the dinosaurs somewhere in the southern continent, that the major branches developed there and then migrated northwards as temperatures improved. 55 million years ago, where we're now sitting, the world was a tropical and semi-tropical world. In Zurich, there was a tropical forest. In Chicago, there was subtropical forest. And so that temperature rise created a window for these things to move north. And then they disappeared when the temperature got poor again, 20 million, 30 million years later. And you mentioned the Adapidae, which have long been linked to the lemurs and lorises, and you mentioned the Omomyidae, which have been linked to the tarsiers and higher primates. By the way, my book clearly came to that conclusion on the basis of morphological evidence. I was influenced by emerging molecular data, but at that time it wasn't very convincing. And so one of the things I'm really pleased about is that tree in my book, which I subsequently published in Nature in '93 in a review article, that the branching pattern in that tree is more or less the dominant interpretation today. And in that interpretation, the Adapidae are represented as connected to the lemurs and lorises, and the Omomyids to tarsiers and higher primates. I think you mentioned the plesiadapids. They've been long touted. This is interesting because a lot of the interesting thing is after the dinosaurs died out, there was a 10 million year gap. And what we have is a bunch of archaic mammals that don't seem to have left any modern relatives. And there's a group there that was once thought to be ancestral whales, but they're now thrown out of that. And that's the fate of many of those things. If you're looking to find something that looks vaguely like a primate, that's all you've got. Plesiadapiforms come essentially from the Paleocene. They're archaic mammals. And they share a few features which are dubiously connectable to primates. I have never accepted that they have any close link to primates, and for the same reasons as the treeshrews. Most of the similarities people have talked about are either primitive mammal features or convergent developments. So, but I genuinely believe that Adapids and Omomyids are connected in the way I've described. One thing I would emphasize, by the way, is that one tendency paleontologists also had is to push, because the fossil record is so sparsely documented, there is a tendency to push individual forms into ancestral positions. And so was suggested that lemurs might have descended directly from Adapids, not closely related to the loris group. But my view is, if you have a fossil record that sparse, your chances of finding directly ancestral forms are minimal, and that virtually all the fossils we know are side groups. And that is precisely my view of the Adapidae and the Omomyidae. They are lemur-like and tarsier-like respectively, but they diverged early. So they're linked. But lemurs and lorises, for example, are more closely related to each other than either is to the Adapidae. So it was the Wild West when I first started, because lots of speculations were made about relationships in primates. One of them was that tarsiers are more closely related to plesiadapiforms than they are to other primates. I mean, that has disappeared without trace, but at the time I thought it was outrageous to suggest that. But and that was based on just a few similarities. Quite often when people suggest these links, they take a few key characters that they think are particularly interesting and ignore everything else. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to take a broad approach, so that I wasn't basing any of my arguments on one-off cases. And so we had that situation. But another more practical suggestion was made, was that the Adapiformes were actually ancestral to the higher primates, excluding the tarsiers. Okay, so it was argued that the Adapiformes led directly to the higher primates. Now, the higher primates have a number of new features. By the way, we followed up on our Nature paper with a paper in systematic biology, and we did some more mathematical modeling, and we did 2 datings instead of 1. So we dated the origin of primates, which came out again around 80 to 90. But we also dated the common ancestry of the higher primates, which is about 45. Primates originated 90 million years ago, and the common ancestor of higher primates, 45. That means that the 50% of primate evolution had happened by the time they emerged. And so it's not surprising the common ancestor of living higher primates must have had a set of new characters. One of them, which is distinctive but maybe not very important, is the eye socket. We have a proper bony eye socket. If you remove an eye, you have a bony cup in which it rests. More primitive primates just have a bony bar on the outside of the eye, and there's no bony plate behind the eye to form a socket. And tarsiers have a bony socket, but you never see it in lemurs or lorises. And there are some of the lemurs that died out. Pat Wright mentioned them in her interview with you, the subfossil lemurs. They were amazingly monkey-like lemurs. They developed dentitions that looked really monkey-like, but they had no eye socket. They just had a bony bar. So for me, there are these distinctive features. I could give you a list of 10 and say, I would expect these features to be present in the common ancestor of higher primates. None of them is present in Adapids. Adapids don't have a proper eye socket. But what you do see in Adapids is some, what I would regard as convergent development. And I think this is a key problem that's been there for morphological trees, is that it's very difficult to recognize convergence. It is rife. One of the most spectacular examples, if you compare placental mammals and marsupials, you get parallel developments in the two to produce end points, which are amazingly similar between the two radiations. So this is the power of natural selection, selecting towards an endpoint which probably only has a few options, and they get filled separately by species. So one of the key points that was used to link the Adapiforms to the higher primates was that there's a fusion between the two bones of lower jaw. Originally, each of the lower jaws is a separate bone, and in some mammals, notably in higher primates, you get a fusion in midline. So it becomes a single bone in functional terms. And that is seen in in quite a lot of the Adapiforms, but it's seen in an awful lot of other mammals. This has happened independently. In embryonic development, every mammal starts out with two separate lower jaws, and they fuse together in most mammals. That is a multiple convergent character, and I would attach no weight to it. But there's an easy way to check on this. Go and look at the earliest representatives of Adapiforms. Do they have fused lower jaws? No. It's something that clearly from the fossil record happened after the Adapiforms originated. Their common ancestor didn't have the character. And so the ideas of that have fallen by the wayside. So I don't think that anybody seriously today is suggesting that Adapiforms are ancestrally related to higher primates to the exclusion of all other primates.
Yeah, I guess it made the news maybe 15 years ago with the Darwinius fossil from Germany, and then there was a couple of publications shortly followed it where some of the authors in the original publication were suggesting that previous link that had been suggested. But I guess there's not been much in the literature since then that the continuation. But you think most people, that's just kind of one-off when that fossil was described, it came back as an idea linking the haploryne groups with Adapiforms?
That's a very neat example to raise, Ian, because that fossil is clearly an Adapiform. It doesn't have an eye socket, and the lower jaws are not fused in Adapiforms in Darwinius. As far as I know, that suggestion died a death pretty rapidly. I've not seen any serious inclusion of Darwinius in any reconstruction of primate evolution with showing it in any way connected to the higher primates. But I was really blown away when I saw it being described by a team based in the museum in Norway, arguing that it was an ancestor of monkeys.
Thank you. So moving topic slightly to another area of your research. So another major theme in your work has been brain evolution and allometry. So could you give us a brief summary of your research in this area and the key insights that your research has given?
Yep. Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. When I was working on treeshrews, reading the literature, I saw that many people had suggested treeshrews resembled primates in having a large brain. But I then did more reading and realized that you can't meaningfully talk about brain size without taking body size into account. And most features in the body scale to body size, and most of them in a nonlinear fashion. So that's what we call allometric. Isometric is when everything changes in proportion. But if the proportions change with the growth laws that are operating, then you have allometry. And that requires fairly sophisticated analysis. With brain size, for example, if you simply take a ratio to body size, a mouse lemur has 3% of its body size as a brain, whereas my brain is only 2% of my body size. If you take that as a measure of advanced development, and the mouse lemur is 50% more advanced than I am. And not many people realize this when I started out, and it took quite a while. And so I was ahead of the game, and I stayed ahead of the game because I got very concerned with the mathematical approaches taken to allometry. And so I was involved in some fundamental developments in that respect. Anyway, cutting a long story short, if you plot brain size against body size on a logarithmic graph, which evens out the nonlinear thing, then you can look at relative brain size fairly simply. We lie above the best fit line where our brain size is 5 times bigger than you would expect for our body size. But the thing is that everybody says primates have bigger brains than other mammals. This is not true relative to brain size. Most primates lie in the higher end of the distribution, but some primates are actually slightly below the mammalian average. And if you look at the fossil record, the further you go back, the smaller the brain gets, because mammals started out with really small brains, and they increased in size in parallel lineages to varying extents. The extreme cases of the human lineage and whales and dolphins that developed enormous brains relative to body size. The bottom answer that you cannot use relative brain size to decide on evolutionary relationship.
Thank you. And you've also done extensive work on the evolution of reproduction in humans as well as other primates more broadly. So why is it such an important area of research, and how does a Darwinian or evolutionary approach to health and medicine more generally offer insights and applications?
Right. It was my PhD work on treeshrews that I said that set me off on reproductive biology. So I've been interested in ever since. And I looked intensely into things like the placenta and ovarian cycles and so forth. And it turns out that treeshrews are unlike any primate in most of their reproductive features. So if you take reproductive features alone, in my view, there is no case whatsoever of suggesting a link to primates. But coming to the second part of your question, evolutionary medicine, I increasingly became convinced that we really need an evolutionary perspective in medicine. And this has been slow in coming. The first proper textbook came out in the 1990s, so this is only 35 years old. And so it's a new discipline. It's taken an enormously long time for the idea to penetrate that we evolved like anything else on Earth. And if you want to fix anything that's gone wrong, you really need to understand the history that lies behind it. Lots of wonderful practical examples of this, but I'm working with a colleague, an ex-student. He's the one who's given me room in his office, Martin Heusler. And we recently published a paper on human birth and the constraint of the pelvis. A short description is that the shape of the human pelvis is a trade-off in women. It's a trade-off between the requirements of upright walking, which favors a narrow pelvis, and birth of a large-headed human baby, which is best off with a wide pelvic canal. So you have a conflict there. And so this has been a subject for research, and so we wrote a paper just about the evolutionary history of that and its relevance to modern humans. But there are questions here. For example, modern human birth is incredibly challenging. It's still very risky. Lots of things can go wrong, and medical knowledge manages to get most of that sorted out, thank goodness. But the question is that something that's been with us ever since our species originated 7 million years ago, and most of which time we spent as hunters and gatherers? Did we have the same kind of pelvic relationship to the skeleton and baby size? Or are we talking about something that's relatively recent? My suspicion is that it's certainly worse now. There could well have been some obstetric challenge early in our evolution, but I think modern living conditions have made it worse. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to know, particularly when in the United States, 1/3 of births now are now taken by placed by a cesarean section. Cesarean section, if you can avoid it, it's worth avoiding it because there are all kinds of problems. One of them, in an evolutionary context, if you have a cesarean section, the baby does not pick up normal bacteria through passing through the vagina, as usually happens. You put it in an incubator and it picks up hospital bacteria. So from the very outset, a baby born by cesarean has an unsuitable gut flora. And I don't think anything is actually being done about that.
And you mentioned earlier about continental drift and the origin of different primate groups. So this question is just, did anthropoid primates originate in Africa, Asia, or somewhere else?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. And again, it's important to know when it happened. Okay, because the earliest relatives of anthropoids are almost 55 million years ago too, but 50 or 45. Our time estimate indicated around 45 million years ago. So by that time, continental drift has happened. What I mean by that is the modern continental positions are fairly obvious, and India has crashed into the underbelly of Asia, and you have the Himalayan mountains. And I think that one hypothesis for where the ancestral placental mammals was on Africa. And Africa was joined to Madagascar for quite a while. They migrated jointly towards India, and then Madagascar became independent and broke away and is now closer to Africa. India carried on until it hit the Himalayas. And I think at that point, a lot of mammals were released into the northern continents. This is around 45, 50 million years ago. The dating isn't quite precise, could have been 55. But it was a gradual process, of course, not like a car crash. It took millions of years for the folding to produce the mountain range. But that collision between two continental plates released mammals. And this is why you get the abrupt appearance of all major mammals of orders in the northern continents around 55 million years ago. They abruptly appear. Paleontologists accept this and they say, well, where did they come from? And this is one possibility. If you go back far enough, maybe the separation between Madagascar and India could be relevant to the split between lemurs and lorises. But this is a hotly discussed topic. There are a lot of people who thought that simians must have evolved in Africa. But one of the things that kind of rules that out is that the advent of molecular trees for mammals showed that the classical trees were wrong in many respects. Many cherished ideas died during the process of unification of molecular trees. And there were a number of surprises, one of which, totally unexpected, nobody had ever suggested before, was Afrotheria. Molecular evidence uniformly indicates there is a group of mammals all more closely related to one another in either in Africa or with origins in Africa. And the point is there are no primates in that fauna. Okay, the primates are not connected to Afrotheria. They're in a totally different superorder of mammals. And so I personally have forgotten about the African origin theory, and I think it has to be Asia.
Thank you. And just a hominin question slightly later in time. So which hominin species or group do you think Homo floresiensis is most closely related to?
Yeah, I mean, my point about Homo floresiensis, I'm not persuaded it is indication of a new hominid species. My point about it is that there are incongruous features that I think need explanation, which have never been explained. Journalists ask me whether I've changed my mind or not, and I keep saying, you know, until they find another specimen, I'm not going to even think about this, because we only have one specimen of any significance, which is the LB1 skeleton. And the thing about that skeleton is the only brain case we have indicates an incredibly small brain, 400 cc's. You don't have brains that small unless you go back 2 million at least, probably more like 3 million years. Then 400 cc's might sound reasonable. 53,000, no. And it was originally thought that that skeleton was 18,000 years old. So the brain size really doesn't fit it. And if you plot cranial capacity's brain size against time for hominids, there's a very smooth upswinging curve, with one exception, which is a hobbit, which falls right off of that skull. People call that Homo floresiensis hobbit because it was pretty small. But there are other weird things about it. I mean, one is cultural. It was associated with stone tools, which clearly involve a prepared core technique, which was unknown prior to the common ancestry of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. So where did that tool culture come from? The suggestion that Homo floresiensis is a member of Homo really gives us a prompt. How did it get there? We have, you know, these are paleontologists accepting this idea. How did something get from Africa, an Australopithecine, which has been suggested as the ancestry? How did an Australopithecine get from Africa to this tiny island in Indonesia with no trace along the way? There is no evidence of any connection that leads to that. And the other thing that there are various things, I find the postcranial skeleton weird, and I can't understand why this is never discussed. One of them is, if you look at the length of the segments of the hind limb, the foot is almost as long as the lower leg or the thigh. And that is not a typical primate. Certainly it isn't typical of us. Our foot is not the same length as our tibia or our femur. And there are plots of this published in Papers in Nature that show this. So I find that weird, and I find it even weirder that it's not discussed. But my point about this is that I have suggested that the most likely explanation for me is that the hobbit, or Homo floresiensis, is a pathological hominid. Maybe Homo sapiens, but maybe an earlier form like Homo erectus, which was in the region. But I think that it is pathological. I do not think that it is a normal representative member of a new species. Now, I have suggested with my colleagues that this could be due to microcephaly, to a genetic condition that leads to reduced brain size. Microcephaly is quite frequent in humans, mainly incapacitating, but there is a form called high-performing microcephaly, where people do amazing things with a third of the normal human brain size. So it's not impossible. However, I do not cling to that possible explanation. I would cling to my initial statement that this hominid is weird. It does not fit into the framework, and I think it does damage to our discipline to try to wedge it into a framework with people journalists making suggestions like, if you have a brain of only 400 cc's at that time, it must show that tool making and hunting and all of those things were possible with a small brain. That is the kind of knock-on explanation that it sends shivers down my spine. So I'm just asking my colleagues to accept it's weird and to be careful about it. May or may not be a microcephalic, but there's some explanation out there.
Yeah, thank you. So you've contributed to the field, not just through your research, but also, you've already mentioned your textbook, but also a general audience book that I think was published in 2013, but also online writing. So I was wondering how these projects have influenced your career, and what do you see as the value of engaging with different types of audiences in these different ways?
Yeah, I mean, the blog, it was an interesting development because out of the blue, Psychology wrote to me and said, we see you're publishing this new book about the evolution of human reproduction. Would you be interested in writing a blog? And so I agreed to do it. And initially, I would have done it under any circumstances. It seemed like a golden opportunity to try to make more public outreach. And I did it, and I greatly enjoyed doing it. I ended up writing 97 pieces, one a month for 8 years without a break. And it was a tremendous discipline to have to produce something brand new. I had a month to research, produce illustrations, put a story together, and then get it uploaded by deadline. And I managed to do that. And I was helped, by the way. I had a doctor student, Lu Yao, who read every single piece and helped me to shape them up. And it was a learning exercise. I had a very good editor on Psychology Today, so they helped me along tremendously. And I have new skills as a result. My writing has improved. I can now be more succinct, I think, about things than I was before. It's really helped focus my mind to take a particular issue, such as vitamin D, read as much as I could about it, and put together a coherent story.
You've also done a lot of translation of books from German into English and French into English. So how did you get into doing that? What initially made you start translating these books and these different types of books as well?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I needed the money, and I started when I was a PhD student. And my first book was by Wolfgang Wickler on mimicry, and I translated that while I was doing my PhD research. And I then went on to translate the collected works, 2 volumes by Konrad Lorenz, who was my mentor in Seewiesen at the Max Planck Institute, where I did my PhD research. In fact, I've now translated 17 books, 8 from German into English, 8 from French into English, and 1 my own book from English into German the other way, which is hideously difficult to do. And I did my last one. I finished doing it just a year ago, which is on, it's called Relativity of Biology. Relativity of Evolution, sorry. Relativity of Evolution by Markus Knopflacher, who was attached to the University of Vienna. And Marcus is a systems biology, and it's an amazing book. It was sent to me to write a foreword to the German edition, and I read it from cover to cover. And it's an amazing piece of work. It's because it covers evolution from the outset 3 billion years ago. And it looks at viruses, it looks at bacteria, but it doesn't go into the details to reconstruct evolutionary relationships. What it does is to take the molecular trees as read, and it discusses systems biology. And You know, when I started my career, I thought I can carve out an interesting piece of mammal evolution here. I'll carve out the primates and I'll focus on them, and where needed, I'll look at other mammals and maybe other vertebrates, but that'll do the job nicely. Having read that book, I can see I was wrong, because viruses and bacteria were dominant for 2 billion years before any of our relatives appeared, the multicellular animals. And they are still with us. And many of the things that we see are adaptations that are connected with the viral and bacterial integration. And so you have to see the world as the biological universe as interconnected. And I can never say again that I can carve out a piece and look at it in isolation.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you today, Professor Martin. Thank you so much for doing this interview.
Thank you very much.